Hey, it's Roger, creator of the Azure Sandbox, and this is our last video in the series covering the new VNet on-prem configuration. In the previous video, we completed all the smoke testing that was required to make sure that the configuration is functional. So now let's kind of walk through some documentation and do a quick code walkthrough. So the first thing that I write up here in the documentation is the Bootstrap script. So let's go take a look at what the Bootstrap script does for VNet on-prem. And we'll turn our terminal off so that we get a little bit more screen real estate. And so Bootstrap basically goes and grabs some configuration details from VNet shared. And these are all the different configuration values that we get from the previously configured VNet shared. We also need to get some stuff from VNet app. Get two things from VNet app. Okay. And then the third configuration we grab properties from is vWAN. So you can see vWAN, we go after that to get these two configuration items. We then prompt the user for input, and we do some basic checks against that input. And then first thing we do is we go and we grab some Key Vault secrets from Key Vault for both the admin user and the admin password. And then we use that to bootstrap the automation account. We have to compile the configurations for our domain controller VM on premises, as well as our jump box. So that happens in this script, this configure automation -ps1. So if we pop that open, you can see in the main routine what we're doing. There's a few of these scripts in the sandbox. So the first thing we do is populate a variable for the domain name that we're going to use for our on-premises domain, myonprem.local. The second variable that we populate is going to be the IP address for the inbound endpoint for our private DNS resolver. That's required for the conditional forwarders. Then we import two desired state configurations, the one for our domain controller and also the one for our jump box. And then we compile those. So here's the where we compile the configuration for the domain controller. Here's where we compile the configuration for the jump box. So let's go take a look at those two configurations. So we have on-prem domain config. This is very similar to the domain controller configuration that we have running in Azure. The differences are these four conditional forwarders. So this is where we configure the conditional forwarders for the four private DNS zones that we want to be able to do DNS queries against from our on-premises network. So you can see the first one here is mysandbox.local, and we do Azure Files here, we do Azure SQL Database here, and we do MySQL Flexible Server here. And they all point to the same IP address for the inbound endpoint for the DNS private resolver. So that's the main difference there. Now, the jump box is pretty much the same as the jump box that we deploy up into Azure. I actually don't think there are any differences. The only difference is that we join it to a different domain, which is our on-premises domain. That's where we get this value from. Otherwise, I think this thing is pretty much identical to that other configuration. So I think that covers Bootstrap. Let me see if there's anything else that I point out about Bootstrap. Nope. Okay, so now we're going to move into the Terraform resources. So the first thing that we're going to look at are the network resources for our on-premises network. So those are all here in this network-on-prem configuration. So I use a local variable to set up my subnets. So basically, there's going to be one section for each of my subnets, my gateway subnet, the subnet that I use for my domain controller, which is this one, and the subnet that I use for my jump box, which is that third one there, SNetMIS 03. And I'm not doing any NSGs here. It's an on-premises network. An on-premises network wouldn't have NSGs. There would be other network security things functioning there. So I didn't really think it would add value to add NSGs for the simulated on-premises network. So the first thing we do here on line 18 is we provision our on-premises virtual network, and we configure the DNS servers to point to the IP address of our domain controller on our on-premises network. And then we also need to, as the second DNS server, use the reserved IP address for the Azure DNS resolver, because we have to bootstrap these machines. So they need to be able to get out to the internet. They need to be able to resolve fully qualified routable domains. So that second DNS server makes it possible for us to do that, just to build out the servers in the environment. Okay. Then once the VNet's provisioned, we provision our subnets here. And we just basically loop through each subnet and provision it, okay? Then this section, starting in line 48, is where we set up our virtual network gateway. So the first thing we need is a public IP address for that gateway, so we provision that first. It's just a standard static IP address. And then we can provision our virtual network gateway here. Okay, so the virtual network gateway, basically we say it's a VPN gateway versus an ExpressRoute gateway or something like that. We're going to use a route-based VPN. We're going to use a fairly cheap, low-end gateway just to save costs, since we're just testing things out. So it's a Gen 1 VPN GW1. And then we have to configure the IP address, or the IP configuration for it. So this sits in our gateway subnet, and it's linked to the public IP address that we set up previously. And then we also want to say that we want to use BGP to configure this. So we configure the autonomous system number to just a kind of random number that we define in our variables. And I think if we go look at that, I think it's VNet ASN was that variable. Yeah, here it is, VNet ASN. So we just randomly picked 65123 because it's different from the one that's used up in Azure for that. Okay. Whoops, I'm in the wrong configuration. So resetting. So now that we've taken a look at our virtual network gateway configuration, what else has to be configured in our on-premises network? We have to configure a local network gateway which points to our cloud network, okay? So that local network gateway has all the connection details to point to our cloud network, okay? So the first thing we need is the IP address of the gateway, so we can get that from our Azure VPN gateway that's sitting in our vWAN hub. Okay, we can configure that dynamically. And then we also need the BGP peering address, because we're using BGP for route exchange. So once that local network gateway is set up, we can establish a connection using this virtual network gateway connection. So this references our gateway here, and it references our local network gateway that we just went over. And then it specifies that we want to use BGP over an IPsec IKEv2 protocol. And it uses a secret, and we just reuse the same secret we reuse everywhere in the Sandbox, which is our admin password. So that is all the configuration that's required for the network on the on-premises side. For the network on the cloud side, we do a few things. First thing we do is we drop a VNet gateway into our vWAN hub that was previously provisioned. Then this VPN site is used to set up the connection details for our on-premises network, and we get that dynamically from our VNet gateway that we just discussed. Okay, so we get the IP address, the gateway IP address, and we also get the BGP peering address directly from that other resource. So we've got a dependency there. We also have then we establish, once we have that VPN site metadata defined, we can establish a connection from the cloud to our on-premises network using those connection details, right? And then the second section goes through how to set up the private DNS resolver. So it's pretty lean. We just basically define the private DNS resolver service first, okay, and we associate it with a virtual network, which we associate it with VNet shared. And then we set up the inbound endpoint, and we use this SNet MIS01 subnet that we reserved up in VNet shared for that. Okay, and that gives us out our private IP address that we use for the inbound endpoint that is used by the conditional forwarders on our on-premises network to resolve DNS queries. Okay. We also are going to establish an outbound endpoint. That's when you send a query to the Azure Private DNS Resolver. It basically implements its own concept of conditional forwarders using these outbound endpoints. And once you have the outbound endpoint set up, and we have to associate that with a subnet, so that uses the second subnet that we have reserved up there in VNet shared, SNet MIS02, right? We have to establish a rule set to actually put the rules in there for those conditional forwarders, right? So we have, I believe, two rules. One for resolving DNS queries against our on-premises domain, right? And so that is going to point to the IP address of our on-prem DNS server. And then the second rule is going to be for our cloud domain, mysandbox.local, and that's going to point to the DNS server for our cloud network, which is ADDS1. So once those two rules are set up, we can then associate those rules with any virtual network we want with these associations. So I associate it both with VNet shared and with VNet app, and that basically makes these conditional forwarders work on the Azure side, right? On the on-prem side, we already have an inbound endpoint set up, so the DNS queries come in through that inbound endpoint, and then they can use that DNS forwarding rule set as conditional forwarders to do further DNS zone resolution that isn't already provided through Azure private DNS zones that have already previously been set up. So yeah, that's the cloud network. And then all we really have left to look at are the domain controller. There's nothing new here. This is all very similar to what we did in VNet shared domain controller, okay? We just provision a VM. We then call a provisioner to register it with desired state configuration to apply the configuration. And, you know, we have the NIC for it. Same thing with the jump box, right? Same thing we did up in VNet app to configure a jump box, right? We provision the VM, we register it with desired state configuration using a provisioner, right? And we set up the NIC for it. So pretty lean, pretty mean, but we've definitely been able to use these resources to simulate connectivity with an on-premises network. We've been able to test bi-directional DNS name resolution from both sides, both from cloud to on-prem and from on-prem to cloud using a DNS private resolver and conditional forwarders on the on-prem side. And we've been able to actually test connectivity both from on-prem, from the cloud to on-prem over RDP, and from on-prem to cloud over SSH, over TDS to both a SQL Server VM and Azure MySQL database, and also to MySQL Flexible Server. I hopefully that's a useful exercise for you to see how to get connectivity established between a cloud network running up in Azure and an on-premises network running in your own environment. I hope you found it useful, and we'll see you next time.